Goedenavond iedereen. Welkom deze avond hier op bezoek in de Singel voor een avond rond de stadsnatuur. Het Vlaams Architectuurinstituut en Archipel slaan deze avond de handen in elkaar voor 3 presentaties van Fallow, Grue en Tijdens, Architecture Urbanism, en een lezing van Matthew Gandy in het kader van de tentoonstelling Stedelijke natuur, georganiseerd door het Vlaams Architectuurinstituut en in het kader van het programma Zijspoor van Archipel. Archipel vertrekt dit jaar van de marges in de natuur. Wij focussen daarbij onder andere op stedelijke natuur, andersoortig gebruik van ruimte door jongeren en op dieren in de stad, fauna, flora, allerlei zijsporen die wij dit jaar inzetten in de vorm van het bespreken via duo-lezingen. In de tentoonstelling Stedelijke natuur, die momenteel hier in de gangen van de Singel te zien is, focussen de bureaus Tijdens, Architecture Urbanism, Fallow and Grue zich op het verleden, het heden en de toekomst van de natuur in de architectuurproductie. De tentoonstelling vertrekt vanuit het gedachtengoed van Leon Stijnen en Paul de Meijer, de architecten van de Singel, en hoe zij naar het gebouw keken in relatie tot het landschap. Stedelijke natuur is een van de onderzoeksprojecten die in 2022 van de Vlaams Bouwmeester en het Vlaams Architectuurinstituut het Bouwmeester Label ontvingen. Het Bouwmeester Label wil vernieuwende, beleidsrelevante ideeën oppikken vanuit de onderzoeks- en ontwerppraktijk. Daarvoor wil ik graag even Vlaams Bouwmeester Erik Wieërs op het podium vragen. Erik Wieërs is sinds 2020 Vlaams Bouwmeester. Hij is architect en medeoprichter van het Antwerps collectief Noordarchitecten. En hij is geïnteresseerd in het maatschappelijke dimensie van architectuur. Hij bouwde tijdens zijn loopbaan onder meer expertise op rond collectief wonen. Nu, de centrale missie van het bouwmeesterschap is het bevorderen van de architectuurkwaliteit in Vlaanderen en treedt daarbij op als adviseur van de Vlaamse regering. Graag het woord aan de Vlaamse bouwmeester.
Good evening. So, as said before, the task of the team of the Flemish Government Architecture is to work on quality of architecture in Flanders. We do this on the one hand by supporting and guiding public commissioners in actual projects, and on the other hand, we do that by stimulating the debate on architectural culture. To pick up innovative ideas from the broad architectural field, we harvest new themes every year via the Bouwmeester Label. Together with the Vlaams Architectuurinstituut, we issue a call to submit a proposal for strong spatial concepts and integrated research questions. We look for topics that could be relevant for policy and that can make a positive social difference. Every year we select 3 themes and support them with a small financial contribution and help them to put the topics on the political agenda. Together with the VAI and other partners, we organize then some public events like this one, for example. The label number 28 was awarded to Tijdens, Fallow and Grue, with the title Urban Nature. When I was a young architect, we talked about the bird perspective and the frog perspective, but back then that were just ways of making a drawing. Today, thanks to this label, I learned that it becomes something real and something existing. And we have to take an account with it as an architect. I hope that you have an interesting evening that will inspire you to submit for the next Bouwmeester Label. Thank you.
1010 Architecture Urbanism is een ontwerpbureau voor architectuur en stedenbouw. Hun werk is het resultaat van een voortdurend creatief proces, geworteld in de plekken die ze ontwerpen, in overleg met de gebruikers en steeds met de tijd als hoofdelement in het ontwerpproces. Het bureau werd opgericht door Bert Gelling en Nadia Casabella. Fallow is een jong en veelzijdig bureau uit Brussel dat zich richt op ruimtelijke en socio-ecologische uitdagingen met een veelzijdige interesse in het open veld van architectuur, landschap en stedenbouw. Fallow is het platform voor samenwerking tussen Matthias Salaats, Michael Stas en Carmen van Marken. Grue werd in 2013 opgericht in Parijs en Brussel en ontwikkelt een praktijk tussen stedenbouw, landschap en architectuur. Het werd opgericht door de architecten Maria Leon en Nathanaël Paes-Cantillon samen met landschapsarchitect Rodolphe Raguccia. Vooraleer aan het woord te geven wil ik ook nog heel graag de sponsors bedanken van Archipel, Nico, Porcelanosa en Vola voor hun steun, de Vlaamse gemeenschap voor de structurele subsidiëring en tevens ook de sponsors van het VAI en in bijzonder ook dank aan de Singel dat we hier deze avond de lezing mogen organiseren. Ik geef graag het woord aan het trio.
Nature reclaims space if you don't give it. In heavily urbanized environments like Flanders, 99% of all fauna biomass is related to humans and their food consumption habits, leaving little less than 1% to wildlife. Our dominant economic models are still based upon massive mining of natural resources, a mass destruction of life that took centuries to develop. We need to bring this to a halt. The survival of our species depends on the existing of many others that are vital to regulate the ecosystems we depend upon and give us everything we need: a mild climate, fresh water, clean air. We have to be activistic and voluntaristic, call for political action, and promote behavioral change. And yet, in the darkest of days, there might be sparkles of hope. Nature reclaims space even if you don't give it, leading to encounters that fill us with surprise and joy, while the presence of others, such as the Japanese knotweed, is perceived as exotic, invasive, and sometimes object of pest control. But what if the presence of these species actually just reminds us that we are, as humans, just part of a larger ecosystem in which we are sometimes the hunter and then again the prey? And perhaps our role as spatial designers is to embrace the opportunities and paradigms of urban nature in an imperfect world, to give it a place in our local day-to-day practices, try out principles of sharing, and create forms of cohabitation. The label Bouwmeester gave us, a group of practitioners, the opportunity to take the time to learn more about the other-than-human life with the help of scientists and the experienced users in and around the campus of the Singel. To give us the time to draw the space under our feet, combining physical data, the stories of history, and the imagination produced behind the drawing board, and produce another way of drawing architecture that is sensitive to the processes of decay, erosion, and the opportunities it creates for fauna and flora. Have a look at the expo in the entry hall, but in this lecture, we want to show you a glimpse of our work and share some of the strategies and tactics we use to include natural processes in our day-to-day work. The first case is a municipal school campus. You can find hundreds of, with concrete paved courtyards, a plastic shed, and here and there an occasional tree. The assignment: depave the floor, open the soil, bring more green, and create a different recreative environment for 3 different age groups between 2.5 and 18 years old. An architectural competition was launched, which gave us the opportunity to formulate a hypothesis of materiality, vegetation, rainwater management, and different types of use. And the first ideas of atmosphere and form. This image shows one of the key elements of the proposal, a rainwater playground that works as a hinge between the enclosed courtyard and the public street, a ludic space that can alternate in use between school time and weekend. And after the competition, as usual, when the dust has fallen, only then the time was available to observe with a more fine-grained look, to discover the local climate, the existing vegetation, the patterns of existing use. The time to talk to the future users, the time to make an inventory of reusable materials and create a testing ground of 50 square meters, allowing us to dig a hole in the soil, explore its texture, and understand the limits of water buffering and infiltration, to discover the incredible Anthropocene conditions, and build a small laboratory of future use. All these lessons were feeding us to produce a final design, the global layout that shapes conditions for hard and for soft, for sunny and shadow, for dry and wet, for activity and tranquility, translated into construction details until finally the day comes of the big breakup. The removal of the mineralized crust and the moving of the different qualities of soil, the planting of more than 100 trees, shrubs, and edible plants for kids and other than human, and simultaneously, the sudden explosion of spontaneous vegetation. Some arrived here by wind, while others were sleeping for decades in the soil, bringing one of the school site managers to despair, demanding us to bring this unsolicited nature under control to the point of asking us to replace the earth with so-called virgin sterile soil. The recuperated floor tiles are stacked to form low walls with a specific structure, creating new spaces for education and play, while the rough textures of cavities and joints over time will form the breeding ground for a variety of fungi, mosses, and seeds of vegetation forever adrift. The ballpoint blue lines of the drawings were translated into a three-dimensional play, outlining that the spatial conditions of the playground have forever changed, until the colors of the painted steel over time will fade and the textures of vegetation will take over.
Okay, I will be talking about living in cohabitation, unheard voices, and hidden data. And I will do it through the case of the master plan we are making together with Plus Office in Neder-Overeembeek, the periphery of Brussels. But before I jump into the project, I will stand still for a second with the Christmas card we as an office have sent last year, which is entitled Some of Our Projects Represented by Some of Their Inhabitants. And what we actually wanted to do also with this Christmas card is to raise awareness that we are not only designing for humans, but also for the other humans that we have encountered in our projects, who are we sharing the territory together with. And so, since they don't have a voice, they're often overlooked in projects. And we find it also a role of the designer to have this awareness, to get to know them better, but this also implies different ways of research or different ways of tackling the analysis of a project, of what we are normally used to. And that's mainly what I'm going to talk about today, so I will not go through the full design we have made, but more about how the process has gone of trying to incorporate also the other than human aspect in our design. So our site is situated in the north of Brussels. It's in the fringe, and it's typically this kind of 20th century site. It's next to the Viaduct van Vilvoorde. It's next to the military hospital. The industrial area of Solvay is there, a neighborhood, a big sporting center, also some leftovers of agricultural field and forest of the past. And so it was a commission by the city of Brussels, who was mainly interested in researching two things. One was the sporting area, who is very popular and has really a reach on the level of the full Brussels region. They wanted to expand. And also in the current zoning plan of this site, it's possible to completely build it full with houses, so to have a sort of greenfield development for housing. They wanted to know actually what to do with these different demands and also how to bring it in balance on the site. So that was actually the main question we started with. And then as a designer, you start with looking on your desktop to this kind of maps like the biological value map, and then you see, yes, it's a light green, it's an interesting site. But we were actually, during one of our field trips on the site, we were triggered by this, which is a temporary sign for the migration route of amphibians, batraciens, that was put there by a local organization, the Groene Wandeling it's called, who is helping them to migrate. And so we were really triggered by this, and we wanted to find out more what is exactly happening, who is also inhabiting this space that we didn't know of before. We went to talk with this local nature group, but they also mentioned this very nice atlas to us, which is a collaboration of Leefmilieu Brussel, but also a lot of volunteers of Natagora and Natuurpunt. And so they have mapped, with a lot of volunteers, as you can see here, they have made an atlas on the regional level of Brussels to map all the amphibian life that is there. And why was this important for us in our design? It gives a bit of perspective of this site in relation to the rest of Brussels, in the sense that you can really see it's an important hotspot. But it also gave some insight in who are we actually talking with. These came amongst others, and there are many more, but so it's amongst others the alpine newt and the common toad, who are also inhabiting the site that we were making a design for, or that we are making a design for. And so, due to all the knowledge that is there, the fact that this atlas was there, but also we were quite lucky. There is also a research project going on, Cohabitat. I saw that one of the researchers, Bjorn, is also in the room. So we could also make use of all this data that is collected, and by interviewing more people, these maps were made. They're not super visible, but you can see a bit how these newts and toads are actually using the site. So it's the migration routes between the hibernation state and when they go to breed in the valley, in the central valley of the Tweebeek. You can see how they move, but you can also see what obstacles they encounter. And so, of course, the roads are an important obstacle, but also the big tennis fields that are part of the sport area, and also the sports facilities even wanted to enlarge that area. You also can see that that's really an important obstacle in how they perceive the territory. Designing or taking into account these other than humans also implies that you have to get to know a bit about what do they like in their habitat, how do we design for them, what are their kind of requirements. And so it meant actually that the design that we were making, it had a huge influence on it. On different levels. So one is exactly the question about the housing and the expanding of the sporting facilities that the city was asking. So we said about the sporting facilities, for example, you can expand, but only compacted on your own territory. So we move the tennis fields out of the valley of the Tweebeek. We can reconnect the full, or we can restore the valley really as a wetland, as this kind of sequence of different ponds that increases also the habitat life. But also the roads that are on the site that form an enormous barrier for these amphibians. Together with the city, we decided to cut them from all road traffic. So they will be depaved and will be given back to nature. And the housing question, of course, it's also reduced in the meantime, so it's not longer, we are starting the procedure to not make it longer possible to make a new housing on this site. This ends up in this master plan, let's say. It, of course, includes also all kind of other perspectives, but I brought it today from the perspective of the other than human. But of course, the master plan, it takes quite a long time before it's really implemented. So in the meantime, and that's what we are quite happy with, together with the local organizations and the city, it's already decided to, for example, block off already the roads. So as you can see, it's done with these concrete blocks, kind of temporary, but so the migration routes are now secured. The case in Neder-Overeenbeek, we were actually quite lucky as a designer that we could make use of all the knowledge that was on the site, both from all the local, from the local community, but also the research that has been done. We are not always that lucky, and I will briefly present another project we are doing. It's in the south of Ghent. It's the Loop, and here we're making also a master plan. But here there is no local nature group, no local action group, and there is not really a lot of research done about the ecology on the site. This translates also in the data that you can find of it. For example, this is a soil map in which you can see the dots are means anthropogene, so it's human-made. We don't really know what is exactly there. So it actually, if you look to the data, it's one big question mark. What we are doing there is together, and you can see us together with the city ecologist of Ghent. So we are trying to make or to find the data ourselves. And so we are making our own maps of the city ecology, and here we are also making our own soil map. So we're taking soil samples in order to get the site, to know the site better, and to also take some kind of systems better into account. Yeah, these are also some soil samples, but we are really in the beginning of this project, so this is done 2 weeks ago. I think in general, what these two projects show is, as an urban designer, we think it's important to be aware of also the other than human, who is also inhabiting our landscapes, and some we can take into account, but also the fact that knowledge and data is very important in order to be able to do that, and that there are different ways and different dialogues that you need to take into account also in your design process. Voilà.
Well, we're going to rewind a little bit on going from a completed project to an ongoing project to a lost competition. But still it's a project that is interesting on the level of management and maintenance in regard to the urban nature matter. So we as Grue, we were invited together 2 years ago with a group of experts like biologists, mobility experts, light experts, to take part in the competition of the Plan des Manœuvres in Tournai, and to turn the plan into an urban park. So this site is an old military field that was dedicated until the 60s to the military maneuvers. And after the 60s, the first Maison de la Culture in Wallonia from the architect Simon Gudesen Oa was built there followed by a sports center, housing developments along the main roads. But since then, the center that you can see on the picture of the field was kept unbuilt, and a spontaneous vegetation has grown, resulting in a quite interesting wasteland that became habitat for small urban fauna, also linked to a more humid milieu with a quite remarkable willow grove. So here is more the urbanized fringes of the site. The competition process implied to make a design proposal in a quite short time, and we had about 2 months to work on a proposal with actually very small knowledge on soil quality and biodiversity, and small knowledge on Tournai in general matters. Here was the maybe only plan that we had received from the city, with a distinction made between the ruderal vegetation, the one that you see in yellow, and the willow grove that is in the darker green, knowing that ruderal vegetation relates to the plants that grow spontaneously in environments that have been intensely modified by human, but it doesn't say so much more about the quality of the biodiversity that was there. But still, the question was how to turn this open field into an urban park without harming what was already there, and many existing relations that were in place. So for us, it implied to work on new, or to try to build up new relations between the future users of the park and this very specific place. Also knowing that the notion of the friche, of the wasteland, is not really much in the DNA of the Tournai people, not like in Berlin, for instance, where aesthetic of spontaneous vegetation is not always so well accepted. And the other thing at stake was really how to enhance and protect these existing living dynamics through design, actually. So starting from the 2 milieus that we had identified very roughly, the ruderal open spaces and the closed bushes and woods, we proposed a quite minimal plan that would actually preserve as much as possible existing soils and trees, but also using the topography to avoid soil movement and ban the use of new soil on site. So we proposed to, and here the plan shows the different, it's quite not really readable, but on the side you see the list of different milieus that we try to implement within the existing milieus. And we propose to develop and enrich those existing biotopes through different strategies, like creating or enriching the wooded continuities based on different kind of tree species. And in contrast of these more linear figures or wooded structures, we developed a range of open spaces from reed beds to high grazed meadows. And these would also encourage in the kind of movement that we created. This would encourage the movement also of local species and strengthen the ecological network on a wider scale. But what we also did, it was to, together with that plan, was to propose a kind of to work with the dynamics, let's say, of the living on a 5 years management plan and maintenance scheme, to literally garden the current open space in order to accompany its evolution, but also preserve the dynamics on site, based on the concept of the Jardin en Mouvement from Gilles Clément, which consists in combining formal aesthetics with the balance of an ecosystem to preserve the existing diversity, to increase it, to use the energy specific to the species, not to spend unnecessary energy, on the contrary, to do as much as possible with as little as possible. And in the different plans that we kind of set in the time, we had proposed to start with the year 0 during the study itself. That would be the year where we would gather more information, of course, on the existing species and biotopes that were there, but also start to kind of engage a dialogue with the green services of the city, but also the local associations that really have the knowledge also of what's there. And also, in parallel, start with a light work on site, like pruning, cutting, to bring light in the groves, but also work on microtopography, small drainage systems, also differentiated mowing, to see also, to kind of give an input and see what would happen. So the second time was more dedicated to observation and to refining the management plan. And continuing really observing through experience. And the final time, but which we would have said it's 5 years, but it could have also been 10 or 15, was that idea of the jardin en mouvement, that would actually allow for that knowledge to combine with the evolving structure of the garden. So here in that section also we try to represent all the entanglements and dynamics also that were existing and proposed. So linked also to that notion of maintenance as an active and collective practice. So for example, we had collect a few situations that could happen on site, and also by the fact to actually represent them, it was a way for us to start that dialogue, to start that also exchange of expertise, of knowledge also with the people that would have been in charge of the maintenance of the site on the longer term. And to finish on this slide, it's also to show that although we had those really ideas to set up the motion, the dynamic on this garden, the design was still very important for us as a tool also to work on the limits, on the boundaries of this garden. And on the left, you have the figure of that main circle path around the garden, around the existing friche, that would actually create that distance also necessary to put that garden in movement. And on the right side is the figure of the smaller path that actually would be defined in a much lighter way as a kind of walkways, or even guided just by mowing the grass to allow for freer use in the park, but also to probably allow for new types of encountering between human and more than human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tintin, Fallow, Grue, for really inspiring lectures. We are very honored and happy to have Matthew Gandy in our midst tonight. Matthew Gandy is a renowned British urban planner and urban ecologist. He conducts research on urban nature. He did a large-scale urban research in Berlin on the topic in 2022, which he titled Natura Urbana, and was published as a book. In this publication, he links perspectives from feminist, post-colonial, and post-humanist theories with urban ecology. In the book, artists, activists, residents, and scientists speak about what urban nature can be. He celebrates a multi-voiced urban nature, which he sees as at least equal to classical white landscapes. Please welcome Matthew Gandy.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I guess the first thing to say is that the topic of urban nature is an immensely complicated field, and equally, urban ecology is similarly complex. And in terms of my recent work, I've tried to make sense of these different debates, and what I hope to do this evening is to explore some facets of this field of urban nature and urban ecology. So I'm going to look at three main themes with you this evening. So firstly, I want to consider the ecological imaginary. What is the ecological imaginary? This is something that I've been thinking about. And of course, in terms of architecture and planning, it relates to the possibility to envisage different worlds, to imagine different ways of living with nature. The second theme, laboratories of the future, I want to consider how cities themselves, either small interstitial spaces or even whole metropolitan regions, can be considered as laboratories and ways of understanding and exploring questions. And then, thirdly, with urban eco-criticism, I want to consider the possibility to extend interdisciplinary research beyond just the natural sciences, beyond just the social sciences, but to begin to think about possible engagements with the environmental humanities and eco-criticism. So, the ecological imaginary, I really had to puzzle over this phrase, and then I realized that back in 2006, actually, I tried to put together a working definition for an interesting essay collection that will be familiar to some of you in the nature of cities, which really marks the first kind of crystallization of a field known as urban political ecology, which, broadly speaking, brings a range of neo-Marxian and critical feminist perspectives to bear on questions of nature, culture, and urban space. And I realize, thinking back to my working definition back in 2006, that I was somewhat skeptical about the idea of the ecological imaginary. I felt that somehow it might have some hidden ideological dimensions, that it might be too close to an aestheticized or even a bourgeois conception of nature. But it's fair to say that since this first wave of urban political ecology, a number of new perspectives have emerged, and the question of the imagination or the ecological imaginary has in certain respects been revisited in terms of trying to understand how we can collectively imagine different kinds of worlds. And this question of imagination and ecology, I think, is extremely important in connection with what I've referred to as observational paradigms. In other words, the kind of inspiration we might get from everyday places or spaces within the city. And one of the key figures who I found very interesting is the nature writer Richard Mabey. And back in 1973, he wrote a very interesting book called The Unofficial Countryside. Much less well known, actually, is a book from 1976, simply titled Street Flowers, with a series of very interesting illustrations of everyday urban scenes, but with a particular emphasis on wild urban plants, spontaneous urban flora. And part of what I'm suggesting here is that simply by looking much more closely and much more carefully at everyday spaces within the city, we can enhance our ecological imagination and also gain inspiration from these everyday street corners, where we find examples of plants from all over the world. So what we're really looking at here are cosmopolitan ecologies. We're looking at novel ecological assemblages in the most ordinary of places within the city. So this emphasis then on the cosmopolitan and the spontaneous begins to frame the question of urban nature and urban ecology in a different way, which leads me on to my second theme, and the possibility for cities to serve as laboratories as well as sites of inspiration. Now, on the left, and it's rather sort of difficult to make out perhaps, but it's a very intricate map of urban biotopes from West Berlin, the island city of West Berlin in the 1970s, prepared by Herbert Zukop, the ecologist, and his colleagues. And I've been very interested in the distinctive role of the island city of West Berlin in terms of developing fundamentally new approaches to urban ecology, partly through an extremely detailed, almost street-by-street analysis of urban flora to develop a whole kind of classification system for unusual urban ecologies, but also a kind of recognition that urban spaces are spaces in which we can explore our future ecologies. This is partly to do with the distinctive characteristics of cities. There's stony substrates, the so-called urban heat island effect, and other facets of the urban environment can indicate some of the kind of ecological assemblages we might begin to see emerging in future cities and future ecological assemblages. Now, on the right-hand side, a book by Roemer about Rotterdam that some of you may be familiar with. And to give an illustration then, Rotterdam and its Natural History Museum have been involved in very detailed research on urban nature and urban natural history with interesting exhibitions and so on. And Rotterdam, like a number of other cities, Berlin, London, Paris, Montreal, New York, Los Angeles, have all played their own distinctive role in building up an understanding and fascination with urban ecology, so that we have a global network of cities which are pursuing distinctive programs of research into urban nature and urban ecology. And if we think about the kind of ordinary spaces that can be a source of fascination, I give an example here from my own work in Berlin. So we have a waste space. The German word Brache is quite often used in relation to such spaces. Behind this advertising hoarding, you see the distinctive profile of the tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, which is a tree originally from China and North Vietnam, but is now a frequent spontaneous street tree through much of Europe and North America, well adapted to relatively dry or poor substrates within cities. But what's also interesting, just to take this one example of Ailanthus altissima, is that in the 19th century, it was planted as an ornamental tree, as a source of fascination, and then it was forgotten about for much of the 20th century, and then recently re-emerged as a focus of scientific research because it's part of these distinctive, spontaneous urban floras. And probably many of you, in taking railway journeys through European or North American cities, will have noticed stands of Ailanthus altissima and other distinctive ruderal plants along the side of infrastructure networks. But this site in this photograph here is important to me in other ways, because the site behind these advertising hoardings was a kind of urban wildflower meadow just off the Chausseestrasse, which I studied for a number of years because it had such high urban biodiversity, but it was ultimately cleared away for the construction of a luxury housing development, which was simply called The Garden. So I was interested in how one trace of urban nature might be erased to make way for a very different kind of urban nature within the city. Now, on this question of strange ecologies or future ecologies, we can consider Anne Matthews' book about a future New York City, where she imagines a New York in the year 2050. And in her very interesting description of a future New York, which includes coyotes and other keystone predators wandering the city streets, she also begins to speculate about killer bees, fire ants, and she also notes a great many mosquitoes, many of them carrying viruses, some familiar, others emerging. And what is interesting, actually, is at the time when Anne Matthews was completing her manuscript, in fact, there was a serious outbreak of West Nile virus in Central Park in New York City, brought by mosquitoes. And globally now, this is an extremely important facet of potential future urban ecologies. In other words, the epidemiological or health dimensions to future ecologies, particularly through the spread of insect-borne disease. Dengue is spreading significantly because the insect vectors are extending their range because of climate change, but also specific characteristics of cities, particularly impoverished neighborhoods with poor refuse collection or inadequate infrastructure systems. All of these things combine together to produce heightened levels of epidemiological risk. And in this sense, we're moving, if you like, between areas of science fiction or speculative fiction and real scientific questions in relation to urban ecology and urban epidemiology. Now, in terms of trying to imagine future natures, it's interesting to highlight some of the influential voices within these broader debates. So, for example, the science journalist Emma Maris, in her influential book Rambunctious Garden, really makes the point that there are no longer pristine ecosystems. All we have are a variety of novel ecosystems, and that nature conservation itself has to acknowledge that the aims and possibilities of nature conservation need to adapt to these new realities. But with Emma Maris's perspective, which is very much if you like, an optimistic view that we don't really have to worry too much about the future because these novel ecosystems are spaces that we will simply get used to. For me, I feel a slight hesitation here because the consequences of the destroying of existing ecosystems have many implications, including epidemiological implications. So in some of my research, for example, in Chennai, in southern India, I've been very interested in the way that degraded water systems begin to heighten the levels of epidemiological risk that I outlined a moment ago. So, if you like, a delight in novel ecosystems should also be considered to be context-specific. And we might also wonder whether some of the ideas about novel ecosystems and novel biotopes are relatively Eurocentric in terms of their intellectual lineage, that we might also begin to wonder whether some of these perspectives are too close to what we might describe as the adaptive Anthropocene. In other words, a confidence that global environmental change can be tackled by human ingenuity, technological innovation, and free market forces. The capitalist economy will be able to adapt to these new threats, a kind of Anthropocene resilience discourse, which we see very clearly in the work of the geographer Earl Ellis. Very influential work, really suggesting that biodiversity decline is not something we fundamentally have to worry about. We are simply replacing one set of ecosystems with another, and cities and urbanization are really just a very small part of global land surface area, and with greater efficiency in agriculture and food production, we can easily offset some of the possible threats that nature conservationists and others draw attention to. So there is implicitly then, I would suggest, within some of this adaptive Anthropocene literature, a certain sense that nature is infinitely malleable and replaceable. And I would hesitate over that and suggest we need a set of conceptual approaches towards urban ecology that can recognize the fragility and irreplaceability of many facets of nature, as well as the other epidemiological threats and other questions which I think we will need to consider in the future. So this brings me really onto the third main theme that I want to talk about, which is urban eco-criticism, and the way that cities have become a focus of nature writing, or we could say they've re-emerged as a focus of nature writing. If we go back to the late 19th century, there are very interesting books which imagine future cities. There are novels that imagine London, for example, retaken by the swamps on which it was built. Richard Jefferies is a very clear example here. So we have, in the literature then, we have examples of books which are fascinated by what happens if nature takes over cities or urban space, or nature returns. So there's the classic novel from Franz Höhler, Die Rückeroberung, written back in 1982, the recapture, you could translate that as, about the city of Zurich being taken over quite rapidly by plants and wild animals. So perhaps an early example of the resurgence of this fascination with the return of nature. And then we have the kind of more speculative science writing, Alan Weissman, The World Without Us, which examines what would happen if we simply left cities and just allowed spontaneous processes, the spontaneous agency of nature to begin to reshape abandoned spaces and abandoned cities. And he describes how very quickly plants can break through tarmac or road surfaces, that over a longer period of decades, high buildings begin to tilt on their foundations, structures begin to collapse, and are gradually absorbed back into some kind of wild urban forest. And of course, in the wake of the Chernobyl nuclear accident, the city of Pripyat itself became a kind of living laboratory of what happens to an abandoned city with the return of nature. Now, these speculations about ecologies of abandonment form one facet in a wider set of reflections about how to write about nature. And one of the interesting questions in relation to literature is what kind of novel, what kind of literary form can speak to contemporary patterns or dynamics of environmental change. So within the environmental humanities and eco-criticism, this is one of the points of discussion which is, I think, of great interest. So authors such as Amitav Ghosh have reflected on the way in which the modern novel, with its classic dynamics, for example, of urban and rural and industrialization, very much emerged in the context of a particular moment of human history. So we have a novel that speaks to a particular episode of modernity and industrialization, and of course the rising use of fossil fuels as well, if we place it in its broader context. And we have scholars such as Ursula Heiser also reflecting on what kind of writing, what kind of novel might speak to the contemporary environmental moment, and in particular questions of scale, how the local and the global articulate in fundamentally new and different ways. And as a geographer, which is my primary discipline, I think what's really fascinating about some of the new eco-criticism is that it presents a different kind of entry point or vantage point for environmental research, so that rather than, let's say, doing an ecological sample or testing water quality, or very important as that might be, we might start with a novel or a poem. We might start with creative writing as a different way of getting into some of these complex questions. So when we're thinking about interdisciplinarity, I think it could be incredibly interesting to develop new kinds of dialogue between eco-criticism and some of the established methodologies we have to explore these questions. Now, in terms of creative writing, novels, and eco-criticism, one of the strands which is interesting to me, and in fact was highlighted in certain respects by the COVID-19 pandemic, is a sudden sense of anxiety about zoonotic sources of disease or infection. In other words, diseases such as viruses passed from animals to people. And one of the most extraordinary literary explorations of the threat of disease from animals is from the Argentinian writer Agustina Bazterrica. And her book, Cadaver Exquisito, the English title is Tender is the Flesh, is a very powerful dystopian novel that explores a situation in which all animals are a source of viral threat. And because of that, all animal protein can no longer be eaten. And what she describes is a situation in which there is a gradual movement towards organized cannibalism and the eating of human flesh, with people raised in abattoirs on the edges of metropolitan centers. She describes how the maids of the rich tentatively enter butcher shops and ask for cuts of special meat as there is a transition underway and a new level of dehumanization takes place. Now, this very disturbing novel is, on the one hand, an exploration of a brutal technosphere applied to the production of protein in the absence of animals, a kind of nihilistic modernity. But it's also, we could argue, a novel which is about the neo-Gothic return of the repressed and the disappeared of Argentina's so-called dirty war in years gone by. So I wanted to mention this example really also as part of a decentering of cultural discourse, that very important literature, very interesting debates are taking place outside of the Euro-American or Eurocentric sphere of discussion. I want to move on to a slightly different example of exploratory or experimental literature. So that is of Jeff Vandermeer and the Southern Reach trilogy. I put this up here because I think the Korean edition has such a nice and interesting cover in terms of its response to Vandermeer's fascination with weird natures. So there is this emerging interest in what's being called the new weird in eco-criticism. And in this literature, which can be tackled from a variety of angles, one angle, which I think perhaps relates to some of the Anthropocene discourse on the malleability and replaceability of nature, there is an idea that somehow we inhabit a genetic soup that is constantly undergoing various kinds of unexpected transformations. There is, to bring in aspects of biology, there is a kind of post-Linnaean classificatory schema in relation to nature, now classified as a nature X, or some kind of amorphous life force. And somehow, in this literature, I think, is a deep unease about what nature really means. And a very interesting cinematic adaptation is Alex Garland's adaptation of these books. And here we see an intersection between the cinematic imagination and the literary imagination in terms of trying to conceptualize future natures. And of course, in this notion of a genetic soup, there is an emphasis on rapid and uncontrollable forms of genetic mutation. Now, in some of the adaptive Anthropocene literature, there is an anticipation that accelerated rates of evolution, particularly in cities, will yield many new species so that we don't have to worry about the loss of existing species. So somewhere in this, and the radical, weird, or unexpected refashioning of nature is a sense of unease about what can or should be protected under the so-called Anthropocene. And yet, somehow in this new weird literature, I feel worried that these imaginary landscapes are excessively aestheticized, so that the kind of swamp landscapes, I might just go back if I can, these kind of swamp landscapes that feature in these novels are detached from their own history. And if we wanted to link back to urban political ecology and more critical discourses in ecology, we would have to acknowledge that these landscapes in the Mississippi Delta were brutal landscapes of plantation, agriculture, racism, and violence, which have led to the kind of landscapes that we see today. So I guess part of my uncertainty or critique with the new weird in literature is that it doesn't really engage with these hidden aspects of violence in relation to nature and landscape. I want to consider a slightly different set of literary representations, and that of what we might refer to as science fiction representations of future cities and future nature. Now, it's very interesting going back to these classic books. So we have William Gibson from 1984, where he contrasted what he referred to as meat space with other kinds of emerging virtual realms. And then Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep from 1968, which of course is the basis for Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, created in 1982. And in different ways, these books evoke a sense of uncertainty about the future unlivability of urban spaces and landscapes, where nature has all but disappeared or been replaced by artificial forms, including, we think of androids in relation to machines that look like people, but of course in Philip K. Dick's book, there are artificial animals as well as artificial people. Now, when we think about these science fiction imaginaries, and we can also, when we think about the film Blade Runner, we can think about the remake, Blade Runner 2029. And what's interesting about these science fiction imaginaries is coming back to the question of food. I was very intrigued that with the recent remake of Blade Runner, implicitly, nature has been all but obliterated, agriculture has collapsed as we know it, and that there's a reliance on alternative sources of food, such as insects, and that interested me. So somewhere within this dystopian science fiction imaginary is a deep unease about our relations with nature and the production of food. So I want to come to a conclusion with a few questions or thoughts that I've been having in relation to urban nature and urban ecology. I think a first question, and this relates to my emphasis on observational paradigms and looking carefully at different facets of urban nature. I want to suggest that my emphasis on observational paradigms suggests connections between art and science in interesting and unusual ways. And one of the artists that I found especially inspirational is the Brazilian artist Maria Teresa Alves, with her Seeds of Change project that some of you will be familiar with. And this involves collecting samples of soil in a series of global ports. And from this soil, she's been able to cultivate plants that lie within these dormant seeds that tell very intricate stories about global history and connections between different ports. I believe that Antwerp was one of the cities that she looked at, as well as Liverpool, New York, and a number of other examples, Bristol as well. So through this very intricate exploration of urban soils then, Alves is bringing together the field of urban botany and global history in a very interesting way, I would suggest. Another example I wanted to leave you with is the attempt to recreate Boeri's Bosco Verticali prize-winning project in Milan in the city of Chengdu in China. Now, this famous and well-known architectural project with the vegetation right up the surface of these high buildings, unfortunately, in Chengdu, these vertical vegetation structures provided the ideal breeding grounds for the Aedes genera of mosquitoes that carry dengue. And it has proved very difficult, of course, to sell these apartments. But the serious point that I want to make is that an emphasis on generic ecologies, which doesn't really pay much attention to local context, this focus on generic ecologies, which I think links with this question of the malleability and controllability of nature, really conflicts with the material realities and specificities of local ecologies. And I think in the fields of architecture and design, and also urban planning, I think this tension between the generic and the specific will be a very important dimension to the development of ecological thought. And then my last example is a still from Franju's documentary from 1949 about an abattoir on the outskirts of Paris. And when we think about cities or urban space, what is it that we're really referring to? Does the city end beyond the metropolitan boundaries, or do we need to think about the city in relation to much more complex systems of infrastructure and industrial production, including, of course, the agro-capitalist system that I referred to before? And if we are interested in exploring different ways of living with non-human others within urban space, if we're interested in developing different kinds of ethical relations with non-human others, then I think this also has to extend to questions of food and more remote landscapes, far beyond metropolitan boundaries. I was reading that in April last year that a fire at a dairy farm in Texas led to the death of 18,000 cattle because agriculture is so poorly regulated. So I think there are important questions then that at the same time expand our conception of what the city really is and the meaning of cities in relation to broader processes of urbanization. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I think this evening we kind of, through the architect work and through the expose of Matthew Gandy, we explored a bit the transition from the city as a habitat for people to one where fauna and flora took center stage. Zooming in on urban nature is, of course, a plea to work nature inclusive, be receptive in our architecture practices that inspires designers to give nature a place in our work. And this provides a framework for green, biodiverse, and healthy cities. But still, we also need to be aware the dangers and to see it in all these many contexts, not only as a green in the city and where the fauna and flora take place, but really be careful that we do not step into the pitfalls, what maybe a dangerous future could lead to. Thank you for the insights. Thank you to 1010, Fallow, Grue, and to Matthew Gandy for this inspiring evening. Thank you all, and maybe we can talk with a drink in the back. Thank you so much.